The Leaning Tower of Pisa is actually the result of human mistake. Just one little miscalculation made in 11th century left us an amazing 14,500-ton leaning tower. Known among Italians as Torre Pendente di Pisa, this piece of architecture is significantly different from other architecture. This Leaning Tower of Pisa is located on the city main square, Piazza del Duomo.
The construction of the tower began in 1173. Originally designed to be a bell tower, it stood upright for over 5 years, but when the third floor was completed in 1178, it began to lean. The thing is the foundation of the tower, which is only 3 meters deep, was built on a dense clay mixture. This mix impacted the soil, and furthermore, the clay was not strong enough to hold the tower upright. As a result, the weight of the tower began to diffuse downward until it had found the weakest point.
So, due to this problem, the construction stopped for about 100 years or a decade because the government wants to focus on the war in Genoa. And meanwhile, at that time, they also hope that the soil will settle because at first it was like so shaky and unstable. So after a decade of letting the soil settle, there's this one engineer called Giovanni di Simone who tried to add more tower on top of the already built tower to compensate the leaning, but in result, it only ended up adding more weight and it caused more leaning into the already leaning tower.
In 1838, architect Alessandro della Guerdaresca dug a pathway of the base of the tower to allow people to admire the intricately crafted base. This caused the tower lean even more, probably due to the digging of its base.
In 1990, the Italian government enlisted top engineers to stabilize Pisa's famous Leaning Tower. There'd been many attempts to right the tower during its 800-year history, but this team's computer models revealed the urgency of their situation. They projected the tower would topple if it reached an angle of 5.44 degrees, and it was currently leaning at 5.5. No one knew how the tower was still standing, but the crisis was clear. They had to solve a problem that stumped centuries of engineers, and they needed to do it fast. To understand their situation, it's helpful to understand why the tower tilted in the first place. In the 12th century, the wealthy maritime republic of Pisa set about turning its cathedral square into a magnificent landmark. Workers embellished and enlarged the existing church and added a massive domed baptistry to the plaza. In 1173, construction began on a freestanding campanile, or bell tower. The engineers and architects of the time were masters of their craft, but for all their engineering knowledge, they knew far less about the ground they stood on. Pisa's name comes from a Greek word for marshy land, which perfectly describes the clay, mud, and wet sand below the city's surface. Ancient Romans counteracted similar conditions with massive stone pillars called piles, which rest on Earth's stable bedrock. However, the tower's architects believed a 3-meter foundation would suffice for their relatively short structure. Unfortunately for them, less than 5 years later, the tower's southern side was already underground. Such a shifting foundation would normally have been a fatal flaw. If workers added more weight, the pressure from upper stories would sink the structure and fatally increase the lean. But construction halted at the 4th story for nearly a century as Pisa descended into prolonged warfare. This long pause allowed the soil to settle, and when construction began again in 1272, the foundation was on slightly more stable footing. Under the direction of architect Giovanni di Simone, workers compensated for the tower's minor tilt by making the next few floors taller on the southern side. But the weight of the extra masonry made that side sink even deeper. By the time they completed the 7th floor and bell chamber, the angle of the tilt was 1.6 degrees. For centuries, engineers tried numerous strategies to address the lean. In 1838, they dug a walkway around the base to examine the sunken foundation, but removing the supporting sand only worsened the tilt. In 1935, the Italian Corps of Engineers injected mortar to strengthen the base. However, the mortar wasn't evenly distributed throughout the foundation, resulting in another sudden drop. All these failed attempts, along with the ever-sinking foundation, moved the tower closer to its tipping point. And without definitive knowledge of the soil composition, engineers couldn't pinpoint the tower's fatal angle or devise a way to stop its fall. In the years following World War II, researchers developed tests to identify those missing variables. And in the 1970s, engineers calculated the curved tower's center of gravity. With this data and new computing technology, engineers could model how stiff the soil was, the tower's trajectory, and the exact amount of excavation needed for the tower to remain standing. In 1992, the team drilled diagonal tunnels to remove 38 cubic meters of soil from under the tower's north end. Then, they temporarily counterbalanced the structure with 600 tons of lead ingots before anchoring the base with steel cables. More than 6 centuries after its construction, the tower was finally straightened to a tilt of about 4 degrees. No one wanted the tower to fall, but they also didn't want to lose the landmark's most famous feature. Today, the tower stands at 55 or 56 meters tall, and it should remain stable for at least 300 years as a monument to the beauty of imperfection.
So World War II caused massive destruction all over the world, but luckily, Leaning Pisa Tower still stands out, even though there are a lot of Americans back then who came to invade the place and to destroy the places for snipers and for war usage. However, a retreat took place after the Americans came in, so the Leaning Pisa Tower still stands and untouched.
In 1987, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site together with the entire of Piazza del Duomo. But in 1990, it was closed. Its bells were removed and the tower was anchored, only to reopen in 2001. Tourists now can safely visit the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In conclusion, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was built and lit that way under humans' mistakes and also nature's factors. Fortunately, those mistakes made the Leaning Tower of Pisa still standing and become one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites as a unique building in